especially in this, under this section, that use the language which is appropriate for this forum. Thank you. And I'll give the floor to India.
Mr. Vice President, we exercise our right of reply to the statement made by Pakistan today. No fabricated words against India is going to change the fact that Pakistan and territories under its control are death traps for journalists, human rights defenders, social activists, and religious and ethnic minorities. Perennial India-bashing project of Pakistan in the UN system is also not going to change the fact that hundreds of journalists and human rights defenders die each year in Pakistan due to systematic killings, including extrajudicial ones. Incessant attempts to maligning India in all international forums is not going to change the fact that tens of thousands of minorities would not stop fleeing Pakistan. Resorting to abusive and unacceptable language against India in this August forum can't rectify Pakistan's dubious human rights record. Mr. Vice President, Pakistan's India-focused agenda demonstrates its own hollowness when it comes to accountability and justice for oppressing those standing for their rights. The pathetic state of affairs for journalists and human rights defenders is well known when the deep state could make prominent journalists disappear in broad daylight at the heart of Pakistan. We only could imagine the fate of those journalists and human rights defenders in territories under its control. Silence is the apt word for them affected through enforced disappearances, murders, detentions, custodial deaths, and torture in Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Sindh, and Pakistan-occupied parts of Indian Union territories of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. Mr. Vice President, while the world has progressed well, Pakistan is still at the crossroads to understand the real meaning of modern laws, democracy, and human rights. The language of accountability, civic space, fundamental freedoms, public participation is yet to find resonance with the authorities of Pakistan. Of course, the world has witnessed the history of Pakistan where voice of dissent is brutally muzzled without fail. Mr. Vice President, we are not baffled that Pakistan does well when it comes to inciting hatred against religious minorities and targeting our leadership with hate speeches. Its well-cherished and inherited culture of hatred makes it the perfect candidate for carrying forward the legacy of intolerance against anybody having modern views on human rights. Mr. Vice President, Pakistan should not make mockery of this August forum when it attempts to self-crown as an ardent supporter of political dissidents, journalists, social activities, minorities, and human rights defenders. For that, Pakistan has miles to go. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Azerbaijan. Oh, sorry. I'll give the floor to China before Azerbaijan.
谢谢副主席。中方对英国和有关非政府组织的无端指责表示遗憾和反对。人权理事会有关决议强调，所有利益攸关方向联合国及其人权领域代表和机制提供的信息应该可信可靠，并必须加以充分核查和证实。遗憾的是，联合国秘书长关于在人权领域与联合国及其代表和机制合作的报告罔顾事实，公开为违法行为和犯罪分子撑腰张目，将各国司法机关依法办案污蔑为打击报复与联合国合作者，此举严重干涉各国司法主权，违反联合国宪章宗旨和原则以及人权理事会决议规定。中方多次通过不同渠道就报告所涉案件提供权威信息，但未得到重视。包括中国在内的许多会员国多次就上述报告表达严重关切。如这种局面得不到改善，势必将严重损害联合国人权机制自身的信誉。令人遗憾的是，这份报告仅针对发展中国家，对一些发达国家侵犯人权、拒绝同联合国合作的劣迹视而不见，令人遗憾。例如英国驻在别国的军队残忍杀害平民，实施酷刑。英国在疫情期间漠视民众生存权和健康权，导致确诊和感染新冠肺炎人数居高不下，数百万儿童在疫情期间遭受饥饿。据人权理事会极端贫困特别报告员的国家访问报告，英国是世界上最富裕的国家之一，却有数百万人身处赤贫。人权特别机制、条约机构、非政府组织多次对英国人权状况进行预警， 但我们岂未看到英国在同人权机制合作上采取实质性举措？这样一个践踏人权的国家，有什么资格充当人权教师爷？中方愿再次强调，保护人权是各国的共同追求，但绝不能打着保护人权的名义，从事侵犯主权、侵害国家安全、干涉主权和内政的活动。中方敦促英国和有关组织切实倾听会员国呼声，摒弃政治化和双重标准。谢谢副主席先生。
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm exercising this right of reply in response to a statement that has been made by Armenia. We are amazed at the audacity of the Armenian delegation to give sermon on protecting the human rights. Armenia's rant about democracy and human rights is ridiculous. Human rights are massively violated in Armenia. Judges are pressured and blackmailed, journalists, opposition activists, and political opponents jailed by despotic regime. Politicians and journalists in Armenia are persecuted for their political beliefs. Last year, journalist and politician Mir Yeghizarian died in prison following hunger strike. Human rights defenders are arbitrarily arrested in Armenia. According to the information by the Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, on August 10 this year, 9 environmental activists, including women's rights defender Ms. Zaruhi Hovhannisyan, were arrested during a peaceful gathering in front of the parliament in Yerevan for not obeying police orders. Criminal cases have also been opened against 2 former presidents of Armenia. Members of parliament, despite their impunity, are detained. For about 20 years, a military junta was in power in this country. Mr. Vice President, regime change happened in Armenia 2 years ago, but fascist ideology of this failed state remains unchanged. The policy of Azerbaijanophobia is prevailing in Armenia. Hatred against Azerbaijani people is instilled in the young generation. Recently, Armenia has adopted its aggressive and offensive military doctrine and national security strategy, which contains racist, chauvinistic, and Azerbaijanophobic ideas. Moreover, the glorification of Nazism is the state policy of Armenia. Nazi General Karagin Nijde has been turned into national hero. Mr. Vice President, Azerbaijan is a stable, modern, democratic country. Development of democracy and human rights protection are among top priorities of our government. All fundamental freedoms are fully provided, including freedom of expression, media freedom, freedom of assembly, religious freedoms, as well as development of civil society. Recently, broad political dialogue initiative has been launched, supported by political parties. The political dialogue, which successfully started with the will help to strengthen our political system and serve to cause of sustainable development of Azerbaijan. We recommend Armenia, which shamelessly proclaimed itself a herald of democracy and a champion of human rights, to pay attention to the human rights problems that are pervasive in this country. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I wish to reiterate that the use of disrespectful language is not acceptable in this Council. We have a second right of reply for Pakistan. I recognize Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. India's cacophonic rants cannot deflect the Council's attention from its well-documented reprisal attacks against people of occupied Jammu and Kashmir, particularly human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and peace activists. India's holier-than-thou statements have only exposed India's double standards, duplicity, and deliberate defiance of its international human rights obligations. Earlier this week, India forced Amnesty International to halt its work in the country through freezing of its bank accounts in an act of reprisal. The only crime of this reputable independent NGO has been its continuous call for justice for Indian minorities and Kashmiri people being ruthlessly oppressed by the government of India. While the world's so-called largest democracy uses financial strangulation as a tool of reprisal against civil society and media, India remains a global hub of terror financing, including sponsorship of terrorist activities against my country and other neighbors. A recent report by the US Financial Crimes Enforcement Network has disclosed the involvement of at least 44 Indian banks, including state-owned banks, in money laundering and terror financing. All these facts only reveal the militant and fascist mindsets of the Hindutva ruling elite, which conveniently labels anyone critical of government's anti-minority policies, laws, and acts of violence as terrorists. traitors and anti-nationalists. Rightly so, India has been declared as the world's deadliest country for journalists and human rights activists, where such incidents have unfortunately become a routine matter. The recent illegal arrest of Mr. Umar Khalid as one of the conspirators of the Delhi program is a clear travesty of justice, as its main instigator of Kapil Mishra, Aurang Thakur and Parvesh Verma roam scot-free. Mr. Vice President, outside India's sovereign territory in IIO J&K, the same militant Hindutva mindset is brutally repressing free speech and curtailing civic space, as it has accelerated its colonial agenda in the disputed territory. From Jalil Andrabi in the 90s to Babar Qadri last week, human rights defenders have been ruthlessly silenced by the Indian occupation forces in IIO J&K. During the ongoing HRC session with India as its member, Kashmiri journalists Kamran Yusuf and Aqib Javed have been brutally harassed and trashed for speaking truth about Indian injustices against Kashmiri people. These two cases are among hundreds of similar attacks and acts of reprisal against Kashmiri civic society, which have been well recorded by the UN human rights machinery, independent NGOs and global media. We therefore once again urge the ASG and OHCHR not to be deterred by the Indian phony rhetoric and continue to give voice to the plight of Kashmiri human rights defenders braving Indian reprisals. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We were surprised to hear these baseless and ridiculous allegations by a country whose human rights record is just deploring. We would strongly recommend Azerbaijan to familiarize first with the numerous reports of international organizations and human rights mechanisms and try to find all the huge body of evidence against this country and against their human rights situations. We categorically reject all the accusations voiced by the delegation of Azerbaijan. They try just to divert the attention of international community from the aggression that Azerbaijan instigated along Armenian-Azerbaijani border and Nagorno-Karabakh Azerbaijani line of contact by targeting civilian population and infrastructure in around 50 towns and villages. Factual evidence that Azerbaijan was preparing for this provocation is too obvious. Days before the aggression, Azerbaijan started drafting reservists and confiscating civilian trucks for military needs. For the past few months, the air transit corridor of Azerbaijan have been closed despite the absence of any threat to civilian air traffic. Most importantly, Azerbaijan has just refused to accept OSCE mission for the monitoring of the situation in conflict zone. There have been credible reports about recruiting and transporting foreign terrorists to fight against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Restrictions on the internet and on freedom of information is regular and persistent policy in this country. But on September 27, right after the start of large-scale military aggression, Azerbaijan just blocked social networks and media outlets. Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh do not have any reason to go to war. In a stark contrast, the leadership of Armenia, the Prime Minister, reaffirmed in UNGA that our country is fully committed to exclusively peaceful settlement of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In a times when there are calls for greater solidarity to fight the COVID-19, Azerbaijan uses the pandemic in the most frantic way for strengthening authoritarian rule and undermine regional peace. The Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, with its monitoring for Azerbaijan, have expressed their concern at the crackdown on the critics of the authorities under the guise of combating the pandemic, as well as safety of prisoners convicted in unfair trials and considered as political prisoners. No wonder why Azerbaijan never endorsed the call of Secretary General for a global ceasefire, which Armenia strongly supported. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We finished with the interpretation right now, and I thank our interpreter for giving us more than 10 minutes today. So we shall continue without interpretation, and I recognize the second right of reply for Azerbaijan. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The last irresponsible statement by Armenia obliged me to take the floor again. Armenia is the last country to talk about human rights while having practiced ethnic cleansing and continuing to pursue the policy of aggression, hostility, hatred, and violating the fundamental rights of Azerbaijani refugees and IDPs. It's Armenia that has implemented a policy of total ethnic cleansing of both its own territory and the occupied territories of Azerbaijan of all non-Armenians, and thus succeeded in creating a uniquely mono-ethnic culture in those areas. We have already stated during this session and can again remind Armenia that on September 27, 2020, in response to the new act of aggression by the Republic of Armenia, the armed forces of Azerbaijan carried out counter-offensive measures to protect its population and to ensure territorial integrity of Azerbaijan within its internationally recognized borders and within its right of self-defense under the Article 51 of the UN Charter. These days, Armenian armed forces are continuing shelling the civilian infrastructures in Azerbaijan, which results in casualties among civilians. The entire Azerbaijani family, including small children, was killed due to heavy artillery shelling by Armenia. Azerbaijani IDPs who fled violence and suffered displacement as a result of Armenian aggression against Azerbaijan in the 90s again faced aggression by Armenia, some being killed and injured during horrific targeted shelling by Armenia of Azerbaijani IDP settlement in Tartar. It's the silence of international community and impunity enjoyed by Armenia that encouraged this country for further military adventures. Armenia's continuous disrespect to international law and the UN Charter, as well as its reckless policy of military expansion at the expense of Azerbaijan territories, must be strongly condemned by UN member states. Armenia bears full and sole responsibility for such military actions. Azerbaijan reiterates that the military occupation of the territory of Azerbaijan does not present a solution and will never produce a political outcome desired by Armenia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I recognize the second right of reply of Armenia.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation had to ask for the floor for the second time to refute the allegation of Azerbaijan, especially when they are covering up the large-scale military aggression. Nagorno-Karabakh has never been part of independent Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh gained independence in full compliance with both international law and then applicable domestic legislation. It is appalling how Azerbaijan denies the very right of existence of people of Artsakh, people who realized their right to self-determination and had to defend that right in a brutal war imposed on them, people who are party to ceasefire agreements signed in 1994. There are fundamental differences between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, and the most important among them is the respect for human rights. Nagorno-Karabakh is a thriving democracy, while Azerbaijan is a dictatorship. In international fora, Azerbaijan conveniently adopted the tactic of blame game, accusing Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh for its inability to deliver on its own commitments, both domestically and internationally, for inability to address the cause of international human rights mechanisms, regional organizations, international civil society networks that report on systematic corruption, widespread abuse of human rights and fundamental freedoms. For the last decade, Azerbaijan was at the center of all corruption-related investigation in international institutions. Baku breeded corruption and exported it, undermining the credibility of a number of international structures. People of Nagorno-Karabakh are defending today their right to live freely in a democratic society in the land of their ancestors, and they know their cause is just. Back in the 90s, Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh hosted hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Armenian massacres in Azerbaijan. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. to continue with the interactive dialogue under Is it point of order?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President.
Excuse me, I want to know, is it a point of order or?
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation is dismayed that the presidency of the Council has treated the states with discrimination and double standard. For the past 2 weeks, the presidency failed to react to repeated use of the word regime in reference to at least 3 countries, including my own, while today you interrupted my intervention because of the same 2 times. This approach is unacceptable. We urge the Bureau to avoid selective and discriminatory approaches in dealing with the Member State. And while I have the floor, I would like to repeat that my delegation continues sounding the alarm over the normalization of brutality and cruelty against the Palestinian people who are forced to reside under inhuman occupation and oppression. And it would be a grave injustice if anyone contributes to this consequential normalization by normalizing political relations with the occupiers. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Well, thank you very much. I encouraged, and all the Bureau will encourage the use of appropriate language in human rights forum. Thank you. I recognize your point. And with this, I will repeat again that we will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. to continue with the interactive dialogue under item number 5 in the general debate on the agenda. And then we'll follow with the agenda item number 7 and the general debate on the agenda item number 8. I hereby close the 28th meeting of the 45th session of the Human Rights Council. The meeting is adjourned.